Okay, so let's look at why we are even looking at this topic. Let me just move this over here. Look at everybody's favourite nature man, David Attenborough. I think he's been really influential. So that quote is from somebody who was looking at policy, and we know this stuff, and there is a connection obviously to this topic, but we just have to act, not just for biodiversity but also for climate. And as David Attenborough says, oh, he's missing his Sir David says, is that we have to change. And that's we can't just expect those at the top to change. We have to change at individual level as well, and it has to be both. So this is essentially what, realizing this fully was what made me change my life from working in businesses, including, as I said, to some people who are in early, time spent in Henley, running a couple of different types of business. But about 2 years ago, I got to the point where I thought I can now dedicate the rest of my years to trying to make a difference, and I could make a little difference or a big difference. And I decided to do something at a fairly strategic level, and loving every moment of it. And it was this stuff that really made me concerned. So I was going to start with some statistics about nature in crisis and the habitats in crisis, but actually you see those all the time, and a picture paints 1,000 words, and this is the picture I've replaced some slides with. Now this is an EU graphic, and the redder somewhere is, more depleted it is, and it's not just land, but it's also sea. So this tells you why we, of all the countries, have a really serious problem in the UK, and some of our North Sea areas too. And it's caused by a number of things, but we are ranked 187 out of 218 countries worldwide for depletion, and that's the map that tells you that. So we've lost 1,000 species are threatened with extinction. We've had 41% of species decline since 1970. Insect populations are crashing. I think we all know that. Everything, meadows, wetlands, ponds. We've lost 1 million ponds. Soil health is going down, ancient woods, woodlands, all of that. I'm sure you've read all those stats. So that's the sort of doom and gloom moment, and there's not too much of this. Let's just briefly look at climate change, because I think that's less familiar. So just quickly to go through that. Where are we? So we've got extreme weather events globally, flooding globally, droughts, heat waves, sea levels, wildlife damage, and melting. So that's the kind of global picture. And then put together some UK things. I think these are key. We've got fires on moors. We've got prey species dying off, affecting puffins. We've got farms being affected by heat waves, urban flooding, rural flooding, storms. Do you remember that railway at Dawlish being destroyed by the storm, and generally the effects of sea rise? So we've got these two linked areas, and biodiversity is actually called the Cinderella of this, because climate gets a lot of attention because it's existential. In its own way, so is biodiversity, because if ecosystems collapse, then the human species is in a really bad place. So what we know, all of us know, because I'm sure lots of us belong to traditional nature conservation organisations, is over the last, you can see this starts at 1970, we have seen a continuing decline of species. And so the thinking, once the idea of rewilding came into understanding, is that it could sit on top of traditional nature conservation, which is absolutely critical. We have to have that still, but rewilding is a different approach and sort of layers on top or alongside nature conservation. There's some brilliant guys who, one's ex-University of Oxford, the other one runs Ecosoulis, a consultancy in Bristol, and they've called rewilding a radical approach to ecological recovery. And there are a number of aspects to it that are relatively radical. All adds up if you go through the science and you understand what is meant by it and what's not meant by it, you could see why it's a recovery approach. So let's look at what it is, because there's masses on Twitter about what rewilding is and how it's defined. And in the work I do, we steer clear of definitions. We just understand what we want to achieve when we get our first rewilding site. And this is the definition that Rewilding Britain use, which is the industry association for anyone interested in rewilding. So it's self-willed nature, reinstating natural processes, missing species, shape the landscape and the habitats, and what you get at the end is the magic of a fully functioning ecosystem. And that's what we are missing. That's what that red on the map really means. So let's just pick this apart. What's self-willed nature? Well, that is allowing nature to do what it's done for millennia. It knows what it's doing. As long as it's in balance, it does it. And there's a lot more to that, but essentially self-willed nature is the philosophical difference between traditional conservation, where you set targets and you manage quite heavily, and this is stepping back, not completely. It's not land abandonment. What are natural processes? They are things like trees regenerating naturally, or things that die being taken back into the circle of life. Anything which is how nature moves and changes and is dynamic. Missing species, this is a big one, and I'll come on and talk about some of these, but over many thousands of years, species have come and gone, but there are some really key ones in our current landscape that we don't have anymore fulfilling an ecosystem role, which is what rewilding is interested in. And when you have a rewilding site, you're interested in these key species for these reasons, that they have all these extraordinary actions. They chew things, they trample things, they build things, they tear things down, they rootle about, they wallow in things, they carry stuff, they chase things. You know, it is all of these dynamic processes that species bring to a landscape. And then habitats. One of the things that rewilding people like to say is that habitats we think about, I mean, there are very many, but say we're talking about forest habitats or grassland habitats or scrub habitats. There are lots of those, but it's all about there being a mixture of these so that you get a broad base of biodiversity. And biodiversity is how many different species are in a particular place. And bioabundance is the other word. So we have a lot of something, again, in balance, but do we have a lot of something? And all of us, I think, will have noticed many species that loss in bioabundance. And fully functioning ecosystems are ecosystems that are rich and diverse and have their own way of changing and growing in a healthy way. So let's look at some of the principles. So these are from Rewilding Europe, and so these aren't ours, but or mine. They start with something really important, which is the reason why there are so many people on this session, I think, is because there's a sense of hope. And if you're hopeless, you don't take action. And if you're hopeful, you feel you can make a difference. And that's what it does. It's natural. There's some creative, there's creative thinking in rewilding. It challenges possibly preconceptions, complementary to conservation. You let nature lead. We work at nature scale. So we're looking at large scale for many of these things. I'll come on and talk about different scales. And people are key in rewilding because every landscape has people in it. Our landscapes are shaped by human occupancy. We are a species like any other. Nature-based economies, rewilding is very good for employment and is a very positive thing to bring often to deprived rural areas. We act in context, so there will always be a setting and a context, and there'll be places where rewilding is completely unsuitable. Working together, it's a collaborative effort between landowner and advisory organisations like the wildlife trusts. And exchanging knowledge is really key, and Rewilding Britain's doing a lot of work on that. So the estate place that most of you may have heard of is called Knepp. So Knepp is in Sussex, 3,500 acres. And 20 years ago, they couldn't make the clay produce, so they stopped farming. Very brave. They could afford to do it. Lowland farm, really clay soils. And the outcomes at Knepp have been utterly extraordinary. If you've been there, you can just sort of enjoy this bit. I heard, I'm 63 and I've never heard a turtle dove, and I heard a turtle dove within the first morning I was there. Nightingales have really flourished. The purple emperors are utterly beautiful. If you haven't been, I really recommend it. So they have had the most extraordinary flourishing since they allowed nature to take over at their estate. And they ringed more lesser white-throat and black-caps in 6 weeks than the previous, hang on, so 30 years, 13 species of bats, and so on. It is great. However, when you go there, you often don't see these things because they're smaller, but they are there because they've been found. So Knepp has been really inspiring for many people because many people have been there because of the and this is why many people know about it. Isabella Tree, what a name to have, wrote Rewilding. And it's been a phenomenon globally as well as in the UK, and it is about this extraordinary thriving they've seen, putting nature in charge. So that is a little bit about what rewilding is, and I'll come back to some detail in a minute. I said there is the biodiversity crisis, and rewilding alongside traditional conservation offers a new way of allowing nature to thrive. But then we also have the climate crisis. So what's really interesting is that rewilding acts upon climate in 4 ways. A lot of people know about the one-way it acts, which is that it protects the soil and vegetation is growing. So this kind of growth of vegetation is sequestering carbon. We actually identified the 4 ways that rewilding affects climate change in a positive way. One is that it heals ecosystem, and as that happens, all kinds of, it's like when you're feeling healthy, things just become more resilient, more able to adapt to change. So healing is a key process. Growth is a key process because of sequestering carbon of all sorts. And the way that things grow depend on whether they start as an arable start or a grassland start. But in both those settings, over a 20-year period, you really start to capture a decent amount of carbon, not just in soil, but also in the biomass above, the plants that are growing above the soil. One of the things that rewilding does is if you're in an area and that's what you're doing with the land, that's your way of managing the land, you are protecting that land from other uses. So there is a protection element to rewilding land, and we're also preventing emissions of greenhouse gases. It's not 100% because many rewilding projects have cattle, but at very low levels. So there's still some methane being produced, but at very low levels. Certainly if the land was being used for intensive agriculture, then there is a big difference in the carbon balance. So let's look at a phenomenon called shifting baseline syndrome, and just generally about the landscapes of rewilding and the creatures of rewilding. Keeping an eye on the time. So look at that. I mean, who amongst us doesn't think to themselves, that is so beautiful. That is the most sort of, for me, it's sort of a chocolate beautiful sight that we're all used to when we travel around, particularly around the lowlands of this country. What most people haven't really understood is what you're looking at is a biodiversity depleted landscape. That is that red on the map. So it may look green, it's not biodiverse. And that's a really hard thing to come to terms with. So it's because what you're seeing is not so much biodiversity of habitat, much diversity of habitat in that image. And I am generalizing, but this is essentially what's been happening to our landscape. It's mostly intensively farmed or intensively grazed, and that has big impact on biodiversity. So what happens if you have a piece of land and you simply step away from it? Well, this is what starts to happen. You get these, so in the lower part of the screen, so around here, you're seeing vegetation begin to change, and whereas the fields at the top haven't been left. And then you leave it a bit longer, and that process goes even further. And you leave it longer, and this is what starts to happen. So this is called succession, and this is where you get grasses and plants giving way to scrub and young trees, and then gradually the trees grow up. So this process continued for decades. Eventually you would end up with a continuous forest. But there's a chap in the Netherlands called Frans Vera who hypothesized some while ago, I think in the 90s or certainly in the 2000s, but a fair time ago, that we weren't continuous forest. Although we have this idea that a squirrel could run across the treetops from Land's End to John O'Groats, his hypothesis is that we were a wood pasture environment, and there's many parts of the New Forest that have these open areas. And he said that the wood pasture was created by actions of large herbivores and omnivores acting on the landscape and deer, and keeping the landscape open. And so that is the hypothesis that was behind the transformation at NEP. So they accepted this hypothesis, and so far it's coming good. They think they've got about 30% trees, 30% scrub, and 30% grass or bare earth or water. So it's this blend of habitats after 20 years. This is taken at NEP, so this is one of the denser areas, but you can see it's not by no means all a woodland, because it's being kept down by the herbivores and omnivores. So this is, I love this. This is a really interesting, the two really interesting pictures, and it's an arable field, and it's the same field on the right. So this is a field that will have had some action by animals, but the growth is extraordinary, and really makes you understand that when nature's given a chance, it really can take hold. So this is NEP now. This is a really good view, and people say it's a bit like the Serengeti, but it's not. You compare that to that chocolate box landscape, it's really different. And one of the real challenges about rewilding is coming to terms with a profound change to a landscape that one is really used to, and I think that's quite difficult. If you can see this from a perspective of biodiversity thriving, then you have a whole different relationship with this view. So, and then there's one other one which is from the top. So this again is a screen grab from a NEP video. So you will see how you've got trees filling in, but you've also got open areas and lots of wetland. So one of the things that I'm trying to encourage people to think about, and I know the NEP team had a real issue with this because their neighbours said, your farm is so untidy, and it's true, you could see it as that. We're trying to make these words, you know, these are positive words that should be celebrated. And I think frowsy is my favourite. These are all words that you could use about those landscapes, but that's good. And there's no such thing as a weed. So work really hard at not saying the word weed, talking about wildflowers or a plant in the wrong place or whatever you prefer. But there are lots of mind shifts we need to make to help biodiversity return. So I talked about shifting baseline syndrome. So one of the things about rewilding, and I'll just go back a couple of slides, is that if you say to people, let's restore landscape from some time ago, how far back do you go? Do you go to Victorian times? Do you go to medieval times? Do you go to just after the glacial retreat? You know, when do you, or the last glacial retreat, when do you go back to? So the thing about rewilding is it's not trying to return to something, it is allowing nature to unfold and keeping an eye on that, because there might be times when that needs to be looked at. Generally speaking, that's the principle. And the shifting baseline syndrome is in touched on particularly in George Monbiot's book, Feral. He didn't invent the phrase, but he certainly introduced me to that. So George Monbiot, Feral, if this stuff is of interest to you. So let's look at ecosystem engineers in rewilding. So this is these large animals who have such an effect, and smaller ones too, but these are some of the large animals. So these are the guilds, they call them the guild of animals that are present at NEP, and many rewilding projects have these animals. So top right, you've got the grazers, and sorry, my thingy is in the way. So you've got cows and horses. They each have different actions on the land. And then you've got pigs who are rootling and grazing, who are omnivores. So one of the behaviours seen at NEP pigs is almost diving into these deep ponds and picking up shellfish, which for anyone who's driven down the A303 and seen those pigs on the left, I mean, they're obviously out and about, but that environment for them is awfully boring. I mean, it's just a brown field, whereas the pigs at NEP have this extraordinary rich landscape. And then in the middle, you've got your intermediate feeders, so red deer and fallow deer, and fallow are not strictly native. Red deer are and roe deer are, but there are fallow deer now in many rewilding landscapes, and browsers and roe deer. So those are the main guilds that they're spoken about. And we're actually working on trying to document the actions each of these species tends to have, and to see whether in smaller landscapes where you can't have this guild, whether humans can replicate those actions in some way. So here is a lovely photograph at NET of longhorn cattle in amongst the rewilded landscape. So the things these cattle do, they live out all year round, they give birth, they live in matriarchal herds, and they go into the wallows, and there have been some really interesting behaviours that they've seen amongst these herds. And then we have the Exmoor ponies, again in amongst this long grass. Hamworth pigs, who do an amazing job, and this is the most extraordinary. I love this photo. What you're looking at here is a photo of two former fields, left and right, or sort of top left and lower right, and then this middle bit where the Hamworths are their snouts in is an old trackway. So this area, this strip in the middle, has never been ploughed, and it's the only place the pigs are interested in. So I think that really tells you something about nature's ability to sort of know where the best place is to feed. I just find this absolutely extraordinary, but you can see they are destructive. And in fact, if you have wild boar, they do the same thing to the landscape. And then here we have a wonderful red deer stag and a fallow jumping. There's some, roe jumping, and there are some fallow. They are beautiful. It's very Richmond Park. I mean, it feels like parkland. So the species that is not on most rewilding projects yet, but is on some, is the beaver. And I'm sure because of the sort of people you are, you'll have read about beavers' gradual return. They haven't been around for several hundred years, and they're now being gradually reintroduced. In North America, there are beavers galore. In Europe, there were small populations of a different type. We have a Eurasian beaver, different populations, and we are gradually bringing them back here. There is a wild population. There has been an excellent project in Devon, which is just reported after 5 years, and it's going very well. The main effect they have, other than putting trees down, but you can stop them doing that, is to hold back water. And so in flooding incidents, they are very good at slowing the flow, and the biodiversity effects are wonderful with beavers. And I'm not a beaver expert. If anyone's interested, I can put you in touch, or look at the Beaver Trust, which is leading this work. So beavers are amazing, and we will hope to have beavers at as many sites as possible when we have them. And there have been some other interesting reintroductions. There's sometimes controversy around reintroductions, but NET this year had their first successful stork chick hatch. and these are the parents. They've been there for a couple of years. That they may well start to spread, a bit like the red kites have. I don't know how fast or how far, but that would be really something. There are bison going to be introduced in Kent. I haven't studied how big the herd's going to be. They've just advertised for someone to look after them. Those are quite something. I mean, they are a huge animal and were here once upon a time. There's also, for people in places like the Levels, there's a great wish to reintroduce Dalmatian pelicans, which are, again, spectacular birds. And lynx, very unlikely to be in the lowlands, but could come back in Scotland, and there is a lynx consultation at the moment. If anyone has anyone they know lives in Scotland or relatives in Scotland, do get them to get out whether they want lynx back or not, because they want lots of responses. But it is the most beautiful creature. I'm not sure about I think the cracking collar is, you know, I understand it slightly take away from the nature feeling, but lynx are really beautiful. The one species that, well, many people think of when you talk about rewilding is this one. And they are all over Europe, increasingly over Europe, strongholds in places like the Carpathians. They're now in Belgium, in Holland. And in this country, they were exterminated, I think it was the 1700s, I can't remember, but a long time ago. None of us have even sort of folk memories through our families of wolves, and we're never going to have wolves in Surrey, or wolves in Berkshire, or wolves in Buckinghamshire. One day they may come back. It may not be in any of our lifetimes, but the wolf is a top species that sits at the top of the, it's called a trophic cascade, but essentially a wolf sits at the top, but we sit at the top too, so we're a top predator, and so are they. Now, there's one species that is commonly seen in the countryside. So in rewilding settings, those will all be, the guild of species will all be kept at low stocking levels so that they don't overgraze the land. But the one species that you won't tend to see are sheep. Now, sheep come from, I say Mesopotamia, which doesn't exist, but they're essentially a Middle Eastern animal. And I love woolen things, they give people livelihoods, but that's increasingly challenging. So the issue with sheep is they tend to graze an environment very low, and environments like these are very depleted from a biodiversity point of view. So there's a lot of work going on in the uplands to look at the balance between sheep farming and bringing more biodiversity back to the landscapes. And in Wales, and that's, you know, there are changes, obviously. These things are affecting people's views of themselves and the livelihoods they've led. And in Wales, where there was a project to rewild a big area of Wales, not owned by, but kind of in collaboration with the community, sheep farmers were absolutely clear they did not want rewilding. Now, one could argue that might be misunderstanding of what rewilding was or the intentions, but is in some farming communities and in the minds of some farmers, it's a very it's a subject they're not happy about, and I am fully respectful of people's generations of work that people will have done. To respect the rights to having their own feelings about rewilding. Where can you rewild? Yeah, you can rewild at garden scale. Obviously, you're not going to have cattle and ponies and so on in here. So what you need to think about is the lower the area, the smaller the area on the left, higher the intensity. So if you've got something that's small, you need to, and you can't have creatures in of the scale, you need to act like you are a large animal. So it's going to be mowing regimes and disturbing the land to some degree. If you have a larger space, you can have herbivores in occasionally. There's a great guy called Nick, and I can't think of his surname, who manages the fields at, what's it called outside Henley? Can't think. Anyway, it'll come to me, but he's outside Henley and he uses occasional herbivores. And then free roaming full time, which is what I've been speaking about, and then carnivore managed, where the herbivores are moved around by the presence of large of predators. So that was a whistle-stop tour through, and I've got about 10 minutes left to talk about HEAL, which is the charity that I set up at the end of March last year. So HEAL is the first charity that's dedicated to becoming a rewilding landowner, and set up in response to, on the right, nature recovery, climate change action, and well-being, which is where the people part will come in. Nature is very good for humans. We are raising money, buy land and rewild it, and we're a registered charity, England and Wales. That's the way that you register. So what's our vision? Is a landscape scale rewilding site. Now, landscape scale is open to interpretation, but what we mean is large enough to have an impact and for us to be able to have all year round herbivores and omnivores. And each site, 500 acres or thereabouts, will restore biodiversity, store carbon, and reconnect people with nature, and will be financially self-sufficient. And no one has done this as a strategic intention across a landscape, and this is every English county. So we hope to have 48 sites, which I'm sure I won't be alive to see, but that's the goal. We're different because we decided from the outset that to control the land, you have to own it, because otherwise you can't decide what happens on it. So that's our mission. We'll be focused on those 3 things, not just on conservation. We will have a natural process philosophy, not a fixed management plan. And we want to be part of a bigger landscape. So those of you that for these things, there are things called nature recovery networks, and our dream is to find a place that is next door to a nature reserve or a national trust property, a national trust reserve, or a wildlife trust reserve, or next to farmers who are farming organically or farming in a nature-friendly way. So being connected to our neighbours and coming up with corridors that connect places is utterly vital. Our mission is our foundation site in southern England. It's for or by 2022, which is looking good at the moment. Second site in the north within a couple of years, and I've explained the size, and then we just want to add on sites as fast as possible. But it's quite a target, because in the south of England we won't any change from £6.5 million. So you know, if we wanted to have a difficult job, we kind of started there. But you know, somebody has to do it, and we're going to demonstrate that it's possible. So mention nature recovery, ecologically depleted land. So we'll generally be looking for land that's been intensively cultivated for livestock or for crops, and ideally not grade 1, grade 2, although I have a slight issue with that because it's graded for things other than biodiversity health or biome health. We'll be looking at grade 3 and below grade 4 land with buildings, and the reason we need buildings is because we don't just want this to be a place to come for nature, but a place to come to learn and to stay. So the buildings will be used for education and accommodation and cafes and so on. So it'll be a visitor centre with rewilding. And we expect, like NEP, to our sites after 20 years to have this combination of habitats. And the other thing to say that's key is that we plan for half the site to be enclosed. So we will have half the site which is accessible by our volunteers, staff, scientists, major supporters, but it'll be the public half where the public can walk around. And we would like to buy 3,000 acre sites, but that's a lot more. So it's really down to the funding we can get for each site. But there'll always be, if there are paths or permitted paths or bridle ways, people will always be able to use those. In general, we're trying to have this idea of keeping wildlife the quiet it needs to really recover. So that's this quick summary, and in the last 5 minutes I'll just talk a bit about who's behind HEAL and the land funding scheme that we're running. So although my background is in business, I've been a wildlife activist and campaigner locally in Maidenhead for about 6.5 years. I've run I run the Swift group, and I've got I think it's the world record for the most number of Swift boxes put up in a year, and we've helped restore our Swift populations. They're improving, and I've in charge of the largest amphibian ladder project, help toads that fall down drains climb out again, and so I've really got my hands muddy. Doing trains is not fun. That was great. So always loved nature, and this is the most joyful years of my life. And then my oppo is Hannah Needham, who is the only salaried person at HEAL. So she comes from a background of science, zoology, and she she's nearly 40 years younger than me, and a wonderful person to work with, because we have a strong youth aim to support youth, because it's their future. Our legacy is their future. So we have a panel of 10 young people under 30, which Hannah runs as part of her job, and they're wonderful. They help us make our decisions. So for example, if we have an offer of support from a major brand, we would not only research that brand ourselves for how well it's doing in terms of its environmental and social goals, but also how do these young people feel about HEAL being associated with that brand. And then we've got around 170 volunteers, and loads we haven't onboarded yet. They've been working since last March on desk projects, desk tasks, and it's wonderful, absolutely amazing. And then we have 5 other trustees. I'm a trustee, who all come from different backgrounds, but all from business backgrounds. That also makes us different. We have advisors in all of the areas that you'd expect us to in rewilding and ecology. So Net's advisor to us. Green is our patron, the tree man, who lives up the road in Hollyport from here. And so there are lots of advisors we don't even list on our website. So our website's got tons of information on it if you want to find out more about HEAL. And I'm just quickly going to tell you about HEAL 3x3. So we were thinking about how could we help people to support this project as a concept, because we haven't bought our first site yet. And we came up with this idea of linking it to What 3 Words. So What 3 Words is a geocoding system that gives every single 3 metre by 3 metre square on the planet a 3-word address. So this is in Hertfordshire. And this is called ground.right.closed. So what we do is ask people to sponsor a piece of land, which enables us to buy it, and then we tell them the 3-word address of their land. And because What 3 Words is very clever, you can use it in a Google Earth type way and actually home in on your square. So that's really interesting, because it means people can see exactly where their square is once they've had it allocated. So we'll buy the land and allocate the squares. These will only be in the public area. People can't walk to their squares because they kind of be crushing the land, but they can walk alongside and look out over the field. Then amazingly, you can program a drone with a What 3 Words address, and the drone will hover over a square and take a photograph. So that we'll be able to say to people, if you would like a photograph every year or every few years to see how your square is changing, we can do that for you. There'll be a charge for doing that. We think that's an amazing way for people who don't live in this country to see without having to travel to see what's happening. And the other way we brought our concept alive was to ask the world's most famous rewilding artist actually to do an illustration, which is the one you see behind me. Which is our 3 metre by 3 metre square. So this is a child's dream square, which has 30 species in this, more than 30 species in this front square. And when we asked, Jeroen Helmer is his name, when we asked him to conceive this, the first thing he did is made the pig a wild boar, and we said, no, you can't do that. You can't do that because wild boar are not officially ever introduced. But he also, the shrew, if you see the bumblebee to the left is a shrew, and he drew a dead shrew. And we said, Jeroen, it's supposed to be inspiring. We can't put dead things in. He said, that's the circle of life. And I said, no, sorry, it's a marketing thing. You need to. And so he drew it really fast, and he kind of rubbed it out digitally and put it back alive. So this is a wonderful square because actually if you look really hard, there are so many things here to see. There's a lizard on the trunk, there's a yellowhammer on the little tree, the tree is surrounded by thorns. It's absolutely wonderful, and just looking at this makes my heart glad. So that's our vision of 3x3. So our motto for this project is everyone together, so people can donate as a one-off. They don't have to sponsor a square, they can give us £1. We've had a £1 donation. If they got £10 million, we'll take that, thank you very much. But we can literally allow us all together to take action for wild things, for all of us, and not for profit. So that is us. We are at rewilding.org.uk. We are on Twitter and Instagram. That's our email address. And our wish is summed up in these 3 things: heal the land, heal nature, and heal ourselves. So there we are. I shall stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much indeed, Jan. That's really great. I mean, unfortunately, one of the problems with these meetings is we can't really applaud, but that was a really great presentation. Thank you.
I'll look at your hands.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to do now is just we take 5 minutes. That gives me a chance to look at the chat, and I'll pull out questions that we got. If you've got more questions, please put them in the chat and I'll try and get to those as well. All right, so see you in 5 minutes. I'm going to unmute everyone, so if people see people, I don't know quite how I'm going to do that. No, I can't do that. I think, can you unmute yourselves? Yeah?
Yeah, that works fine.
Great. So if you want to unmute yourselves, please do chat, and if you want to take a break, please do that. And it's now 8:22. So say by 8:30, we come back and we've got half an hour of questions.
Put the kettle on.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Liz.
Hi. Hi, Hannah.
Can we get more people on the screen?
We'll have a...
Hello, Sally. Hello, Dave.
Hi there.
Hi.
You're on a Zoom. I haven't seen you for a long time.
No.
Yeah.
Have you been...
The 3
And
pages.
you still walking?
Oh, yes.
Good. I thought you must be, but yes, you go early still.
I passed by you quite a lot, yes.
Yeah.
How is your allotment?
Fine. Wet and muddy at the moment, as you can imagine. But no, it's fine. Yeah. We've got a list of jobs to do.
Yes. Building a new compost bin, being one.
Yeah.
New rhubarb to get in. There's always things to do.
We've got things to eat still. So.
This goes.
How are you, Hannah? Where's Hannah? She's gone.
Hello, Richard.
Hello. We're just looking through the pages because I'm. Hang on. I'll come back.
How many
Oh,
pages?
there we are.
Oops.
We're not muted, are we anymore?
No.
Actually, a snowy picture. Oops.
We're just looking at the questions have all. Oh well, has Peter got? Patrick, have you got all the questions?
I've got some of them, but if you want to add some more, please do so, and I'll try and get to those as well.
Okay, right. Oh yes, Richard's going to write one, I think there. So that's at the bottom. The bottom. Or do you want me to type it? I'm sorry.
No.
Interesting noises.
How do I feel?
Have you finished the question?
Yeah.
So, chat to everyone. How do we know whether it's sent, Patrick?
Well, did you put it into chat?
It's just in chat, yes. So just do it.
Yeah.
Has it appeared?
Oh, sorry.
Or have I deleted it?
No. I'm just in the middle of a very delicate operation here. Jackie, how do you get low nitrogen grasslands? We talked.
That's the one.
That's the one. That's the one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that it's something that Isabella Tree does deal with that in her book. And the other person who's controversial is who did a TED talk on rewilding in Africa, and I can't name now, Safari, I think, and he talked about massive herds of large animals, large herbivores, and as he put it, pissing and shitting, and trampling, and that they found that that actually restores the really low nitrogen grassland. So there are ways that nature can heal itself. The other thing.
Last time I looked at it, shit was full of nitrogen.
Yes. So the other thing that is something that we weed out of our lawns, but which is really excellent, is clover. Because clover is a legume, and so it will fix nitrogen all on its own. So encouraging, well, at least not discouraging clover is a really good way of enriching land.
Actually, we do have a multi-species lawn without much grass.
Yeah, it probably looks a lot like mine then.
Very popular with all the birds, isn't it?
There's nearly always something for the birds to find on our lawn.
Yes,
most people look at it and say, "Is that a lawn?"
Yeah.
Yeah, same here.
That's exactly like my lawn then.
Think of that then. Is that all right? Tim?
Very nice. Best way for a lawn to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've left areas of our lawn to grow up, and we've got quite a bit of wild carrot which is spreading, and teasels too. And we've not got a very good big garden. It's a town garden in Maidenhead. This year we noticed the goldfinches coming down onto the deed heads about a week ago in the garden for both those plants, which we've never seen before. So that was lovely to see. I don't know how much they tend to prefer the sunflower seeds in the feeders, but still we did see them feeding naturally.
We get them on evening primrose, don't we? Seeds.
Yeah.
Usually the evening, ones that come up wild, they usually turn up for those. There was a problem with, wasn't there, Jan, with the what's the name of the farm in the Netherlands? Wasn't there a great starvation that happened?
Yes, that was a really interesting case study, because people that ran, I mean, I say this because of my background is in public relations work, and the people that ran that, I mean, I'm really summarising, were very interested in having a large area with stocks of with herds, and for them, the lack of food, the dying off of animals was a natural process. So that's how they saw it. They saw it literally as a natural process. And they didn't consider the PR effects of dead and dying animals in front of people. And it was not.
It didn't. Yes, they had to.
Sorry,
intervene
I couldn't hear myself because someone else was speaking. But yeah, and so it was a PR disaster because it didn't. You can't do that. These animals were in a natural setting. Somewhere where there were no borders, they would be roaming, and there would be starvation die-offs. But we can't do that in the 21st century or 20th century as it was. It's not possible. So numbers have to be managed in other ways, and that's a whole separate topic. Yeah, it's Spartus it's called, and it was a lot was learned, I would say, by those guys.
Yeah, I think, Jan, that question does come up, so we might want to touch on it.
Sure.
Shall I start with some questions?
Sure.
The first one that came through was from Robert, and it's about what about self-sufficiency, food production for the nation? And what's the balance between rewilding and food production?
So we would bow to the government on this one, and they have called for 500,000 hectares of new space for nature. And so our 500 hectares in the south of England, followed by 500 hectares in the acres in the north, south, and then the north, is contributing to that government goal. So we would say that if the government believes that the nation will be served by that scale, more actually, in some people think more, of land being given back to nature. And we have to decide what we're going to do. Is if we're happy to be the most nature depleted country with it getting worse, that's fine. Now there's an understanding of how vital ecosystems are for all of us, for all kinds of reasons. It can't continue. And the other shift that's happening is, if you read up on planetary diets, the shift towards having maybe 1 or 2 meat meals a week, or maybe no meat meals a week, but certainly cutting back on meat consumption, will mean that there is a shift of land used for growing food for the cattle particularly, but food for other animals. So there's going to be a sort of large scale shift. And the other thing to say, which is interesting, is that I think I haven't read anything about this, but I'd be interested if anyone's seen any reports, is that of all the crises we could have had where our food security could have been put to the test, would be this pandemic. So we've been nearly a year, and clearly it's been okay. We've had some shelves empty because people did lots of panic buying. As far as I can see, would be a world war that could, where our shipping lanes were again blocked and there were no flights and so on, where we would be in need, and then the government would be telling people to turn their land into places to grow. I'm sure there will be a government edict. So at the moment, it's not a black and white thing, it's degrees of change, and it's going to happen at a scale that fits with government goals, would be my answer.
Great, thanks, Jen. Sam's asking, what does intermediate feeders mean? What's their role?
I'm not an expert on intermediate feeders, but my understanding is they are with grazing and browsing. They are doing they feed in several ways. But if there are people here who know more about deer than I do, chip in.
Okay. Terry's made a point here, which is that as we decrease artificial fibre, which is something we want to do, wool is inevitably going to become a more significant product, or might do. So is the space for sheep?
So there's someone who's not muted, and I'm not hearing you very well because there are noises coming in.
Yes, I wonder if everyone could mute themselves for the moment.
On stoves, if you could mute. I don't know if you're making the noise, it might not be you, but.
So sorry. So Terry's asking, as we try and decrease artificial fibre, there may be a need for wool, and there may be a need for sheep. How do we deal with that relative to turning land over for rewilding, or for other nature conservation issues?
Again, I would say that's not, I would refer that one, let's say, to the government, and they are changing the way that farmers are being paid over the next 7 years. It's 2028, that's shifting the system, and it is becoming an environmental system. And it's a kind of, I guess it's a market system. So the moment fleece is 30 pence, not enough of us are using wool. We've got to stop wearing fleeces and washing fleeces, as in artificial fleeces. Wool is vital, but the scale of sheep in this country is vast, and what we don't have is a picture without sheep operations being sustained by subsidies, and it's really difficult because it's a way of life. Sheep are hefty to landscapes. You know, it is a huge change, but it's not something that rewilding will bring about. That will be brought about by changes in government payments, in what younger people want to do, and so on. So yeah, I agree. I think wool is a vital part of a non-artificial fibre clothing material.
So now we've got Katerina has raised the point that we were just discussing earlier, or avoiding earlier, which is what is the plan to manage the grazing population? And I think
Yes.
that that NEP, they've got a plan, haven't they?
Yeah, so NEP have a meat production line. So their herds over a year, and they put their animals into meat for human consumption. HEAL's not going to do that. We are going to look at various forms of herd management that enable us to manage our herds in a way which doesn't require us to have a meat production business. We're sounds strange to say we're a vegetarian organisation. That will be operated in a vegetarian way. Our cafes will be vegetarian because we're interested in planetary health and individual health as well as animal welfare is in there somewhere. But it's really about many of our supporters are young, and that is what young people are increasingly moving towards. We've got people who are expert looking at how we can manage herds. Wildlife trusts, and I think the RSPB have female-only herds, which is obviously how dairy herds are. Dairy herds are artificially inseminated, so it's not natural. But on the other hand, you know, it's a tricky one. It's not an easy. There's no right answer to that. Yeah. We don't plan to slaughter for food, our own food.
Thank you. There's a question that I was thinking of, which John Carlson has raised, which is what about invasive species? What role would they play? And more to the point, how do you control them? So Japanese knotweed, Himalayan balsam, those sorts of plants. Do you just rewild, let nature, or do you actually you manage that?
Yeah, I mean, some of them you have to by law, but yeah, no, they have to come out. Invasive species. Those that are listed as invasive. I mean, everything we do is going to be ecologist advised and science based. So everything from how we deal with invasive species to reintroductions, all of that is based on expert advice because that's not our background. And so no, invasive species are a no-no.
Thank you. There's a word of support here from Rebecca about wolves, and say they haven't been around for 300 years. It'd be great to bring them back, but because the landscape's changed so much, there's probably not an opportunity to do that. And I think you've already touched on that one in your talk.
Scotland, maybe. Scotland might.
Yes, is it Paulson who owns half of Scotland?
As Paulson, yeah, he's a huge.
So he might well do that. Yeah.
I think lynx come, then wolves might, but lynx would be the first.
Right.
The first one.
There's a comment here from Andrew that when he saw the screen with this is like Alice's Meadow, Murcott in Oxfordshire. So we've on Otmore. So we have got an example local to here, which would be interesting. Whether you can visit it or not, or whether you should visit it, is another matter. Sue Turner said, could you get families to buy a square for each member? You know, is there an opportunity to roll it out in that way?
Yeah. So yeah, we often get. In fact, while I was in the break, somebody's just bought 5 squares, and if it's for a family, they get allocated together so that they have their pot together. And one person bought 18, sponsored, because we own it. sponsored 18 squares for her daughter's 18th, which is really lovely. Some people can buy them as gifts of a sponsorship. But yes, any combination.
So Jackie's put in a question here. How do you get low nitrogen grasslands with short turf, not very into a rewilding scenario? They were product of grazing, and particularly we got that on the chalk downs. So how do you start all this off?
I don't think, well, we wouldn't want to rewild something that was already biodiversity rich.
Yeah.
The rule is you don't wreck something that's already biodiverse by doing something else to it. And we're looking for, let's call it standard intensively farmed lands. That's what we're after. That's where the depletion has gone down. Where there's already rich biodiversity, and that's something that should remain. So we're additive, not replacing that.
Yes, I've been having a look at carbon sequestration, and agricultural land that's ploughed is right down at the bottom of the list. Yeah, thank you. We've got a couple of people saying great and thank you. Definitely, I'm thinking of gifting a piece of land through your website. How do you use the donated money to rewild the land? Perhaps you could just explain a bit of the process.
What was how do you use the
money to rewild? In other words, what's the process?
Yeah, so we never expect to raise the money we need, 6.5 million, say, which is 5 million for the land and 1.5 for the buildings and refurbishing the buildings. That's never going to come from individual crowdfunding, certainly not in the first few years. So the Heal 3x3 crowdfunding process is part of that. So Heal has a land fund, and the money we get for Heal 3x3 goes into that land fund. It's in charitable terms, it's restricted funds. So that will go towards payment of the land. And the method we are looking at, I don't know if we've got, but this is Chatham House rules, so I'm going to mention this, but no one's to put it on social media, or if you're a journalist, don't use it. We are looking at a lending strategy using patient loans as well as a giving strategy. So those two together, there's a appetite for supporting rewilding or nature recovery. That'll be the way that we do it. So no one's done this before, so we don't know how much of the 250 acres will be crowdfunded. We think that once we have the site, we'll still be offering sponsorships. That will accelerate. But yeah, that's a part of the arrangement. So money comes into a third-party donation platform. We claim gift aid if someone is gift aid eligible. And the money is ring-fenced in escrow, effectively.
Thank you. There's quite a complicated question here from Sharon. And rather than reading out, I would say, is there a way that people can get in touch with you if they have questions arising after this? Do you have an email on your site that they can send questions to so that you can answer them?
So we have on our contact page, which is on the top, you'll see we have a form, and you just fill out your name, address and email and put your message in the box. And then we'll answer them as quickly as we can. Right.
Well, I think, what I'd suggest is if anyone else has got a burning question, please unmute and put your hand up. But I think we've come to the end of the questions on chat. So does anyone else have anything they'd like to ask at this stage? There's a slight challenge for me because I only get about a third of the people on the screen. But, so if you could be patient, I will try. Now, quite a lot of people have got their video off, so that makes it hard.
Gosh.
Hi, Jan.
Hey.
I was just wondering, when you identify a site that you wish to rewild, or rather it's, how do you identify those sites? They need to be large enough. Do you find a site that you wish to rewild and then go onto the site and do an ecological survey, or are there things you do beforehand to identify whether it will indeed be suitable to rewild?
There's a prior step. So the way you have to think about it is buying a house. So you might know that you want to buy a house in a particular road in Henley and you wait a long time and no house ever comes up. Same for us. So we've identified Somerset to Kent, south of the M4, maybe marginally north of the M4, but that's the range of counties. And the reason we've had to a big range is because we don't know where suitable farms will come up. And we've got a really good national buying agent who sees things that, say, Savills put up, also hears about things. And it is totally down to supply. So we could be ready with the money sitting in the bank, and it depends on what's for sale. So I think people think that we have this big choice, but it's not much land moving at the moment. It's a lockdown because of COVID primarily. So the answer is that if we are lucky enough to have a choice of suitable sites, then we do the assessment. So we look at what habitats are there already, are there specialist habitats that we would have to take out, or not take out, but wouldn't buy it if it had too much of a specialist. Unlikely if it's been an intensive farm. Does the local council want us there? Does the local community want us there? One of the tricky parts is like if you find a house you want, you move as fast as you possibly can. And people talk about, and we agree with it, the importance of community consultation and engagement. If you are trying to secure something and trying to get to exchange and going through the legal work, the ability to do a pre-exchange major consultation, you could be outbid and lose it. So there is a real challenge of community work, but obviously engaging with the community is key, and we would try and do that beforehand as much as we can, but not in a sort of large organised scale, because I think there just won't be time. Yes, we've got people who are looking not just at the site themselves, from a soil point of view, a tree point of view, biodiversity point of view, and just the water that's there if there's ponds or streams. So all of that, and also connectedness, transport links. It's a huge list. It's a really long list, actually, of a wish list, really.
Yes, yeah.
So, Jan, I've got a few more questions. How long are you okay to go on for a bit longer?
Okay, keep going, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Rebecca said animals like cows and sheep are an important part of the carbon cycle, sheep even. So I guess that's saying, do we do away with them altogether? And I think perhaps you've answered that one already, saying that that's really down to government intervention. You referred to, this is Rita and John, you've referred to keep at low stocking levels. Does that imply human intervention or something else?
Because we have roads and fences and towns and cities, our animals can't roam like they would have done once. So inevitably, we are operating within a human landscape. So there is no getting away from the fact that we can't just release the animals. There are regulations, they have to be checked and tagged, and there are, at the moment, they have to be kept as if they were farm animals. That may change, but that's the current situation. So yes, there are no predators. These animals would have been managed once upon a time by lions, which were in this country, by wolves, by lynx. They're not there anymore, so we have to act as top predator. Whether that's moving the animals to another site or running the herds in such a way that they don't reproduce, still up for discussion, but yeah, we do have to manage.
There's quite a complex calculation from Nick about the cost of these sites, and saying is there an opportunity for smaller sites, basically, and rather than spending millions on larger sites, or is there a suitable scale for rewilding?
It's all about how you run the animals. So if it's too small, then the animal management versus the landscape not being overgrazed is a difficult dynamic. And the advice we got from Net was try to get 500. We've looked at lower than that. Just more challenging if you want to keep an area wildlife only, mainly. Just means the bigger the better. Nature really thrives when it has space. So we're just going for a big number. But if people want to do things, then you can do it in your garden and you can have an effect. If you want the dynamic action of herbivores, create these, and omnivores to create these spaces, that starts to happen when you have a bit more room.
Great, thank you. There's a question here which I can't remember from the book, is what wasn't ragwort left to be controlled naturally at NEP? I can't remember what they did with ragwort. Can you? Yeah.
So ragwort is a problem in normal equine or farming situations, because all other, I don't know if you, but I've seen fields where ponies are, where the grass is just gone, or horses are, and if there is ragwort in there and they're hungry, they'll eat it. That's the first thing. If hay is taken and ragwort is dry in that hay, it will be eaten by animals, and it affects their, I think, livers or kidneys. So that's not very good. Ragwort seeds travel, I think I've seen some study, there is a limit, but I guess it depends on how windy it is. But what NEP had to do, and they still do it as far as I'm aware, is have a ragwort-free buffer zone. So they actually pulled the ragwort where it was adjacent to a farmer who felt the ragwort could affect his or her livelihood. And that's about cooperation as a neighbour, being a good neighbour. So ragwort is not generally pulled up at NEP unless it's in a marginal area next to a neighbour.
So there's another complicated question here from Andrew. How wild is wild? And it goes on really to say, how do you take soil type? Oh, that's the second subsidiary question. So one is expectations against reality of 99% of UK land being part of the anthropogenic biome. So what he's saying is really that there's going to be a certain amount that's always going to be human controlled. But he says, how do you take soil type? This is very important, I think, because it speaks to the question, you know, from Jackie, and how do you take soil type into account when you're with the rewilding balance? And this, around here, of course, it is chalk grassland, which it can be a very rich habitat in its own right.
Well, on our brief to our land agent, we've said, don't find us something that's on chalk. We've got a specific, it's an exclusion type of land for us, because we know that it's often a delicate and rich, and I covered that before, I think. But, yeah. If we have a choice of, so we find a farm, it's 500 acres, it's in, I don't know, Wiltshire or Dorset, then an ecologist will come along with us once we've decided it's a possibility and we've put an offer in. At that point, we're not committed. The ecologist will come and assess it, and we'll get advice. And if they say this is a really good place to buy for these reasons, then we would seriously consider it. But if they said it wasn't for reasons of whatever, then we would not look at it. So yeah, we'll rely on them.
Thank you. There's a question here which I think probably I could spend a lot of time on. Do you have a book recommendation? Any book recommendation on rewilding, conservation, ecology, or wildlife?
Yes, there's a list on our website. So if you look in, the pages have just changed, but one of the pages down towards the bottom is a good book section. I think it might be in the about page, but there's a good book section. There's a long list of books. It's not definitive, but the key reads, I think, if you're interested in this area, are Rewilding, which is it's very, very well researched, but it's an experience, it's a lived experience. So it's wonderful, because anyone who doubts this is worth doing, if you read Rewilding, I can't believe anybody would read that and not think this is worth doing, within, you know, within reason. And there is a wonderful book by Paul Epson and Kane Blythe, the Ecological guys, who have phrased it's Rewilding, a radical approach to ecological recovery, which is really good. Looks a lot at herbivores. And George Monbiot's Feral, which is quite a, and George Monbiot is a fairly radical writer, but nevertheless his work is really interesting. And there are lots of others that are rewilding oriented, but they're the really key three. And then you get species book like the Beaver book, which are interesting.
So I think probably that's it pretty much for questions. A lot of comments here thanking you for the talk. And I think what I'll try and do is we'll save the chat, and if possible, we'll get you a copy of the chat so you can see what's been said. and perhaps that it's something that we can host as well, so that if people want to read through, there's some useful comments from other people here as well. So really, it's down to thank you very much indeed, Jan, for your very informative talk this evening. I've got David, you want to say something?
Go on, David, last minute.
Hello, hello, Patrick. Yes, the land that's rewilded, once it's been rewilded, is it going to be, and I heard the mention of buildings for people to access, is got 500 acres, is that going to be open for people to do limited walking in, or for research, or is it going to primarily shut off, locked up from the rest of us?
So half the land, broadly speaking, will be for wildlife and for access by our staff, our volunteers, scientists, ecologists, anyone that's coming to help us, and also people who have significantly contributed to the land. And the other half will be public access with paths. We hope to have wheelchair accessible paths, and the wildlife are affected by human presence. So so it's a balance. And in fact, Isabella Tree wrote a piece in The Guardian about it recently, saying how hard it is to get the balance right, because NEP have had 30,000 visitors in a couple of months because the stalk, which is completely overwhelming. We have to have a balance, and that's the plan.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Well, thank
And
you.
so just Patrick, one thing somebody asked was, Barbara said no talk to the Midlands. That'll come, don't worry, every county, remember, so if we get enough money, the Midlands will be third, probably. Somebody said, how wild is wild? And that's a good question, but that's a philosophical question. So we are focused on practical action. So everything we do is about getting enough money so that you can all visit us in a year's time and say, I saw the first healed site before it was wild. We haven't got the time and the energy to debate. It's fascinating stuff, but we just don't have the time to debate it. And it's really valid to debate these things. We just don't debate them. And we have no wilderness left. But you can still have wonderful wildlife, which is and biodiversity, which is what we want.